Good morning, afternoon or evening to all of you, and thank you for taking the time to join us at this event. I'm James Revel. I'm the program lead for WMD and other strategic weapons here at UNIDIR, and I'm delighted to be able to moderate this event. It is the second in a series of events that UNIDIR is hosting that are focused on lessons learned for the Biological Weapons Convention Review Conference. At the first event, this featured Ambassador van den Eyssel and Professor Marie Chevrier. A recording of that event is available on the UNIDIR website, and we do hope to do a third event in due course. The purpose of this series is to aid states parties in their preparations for the 9th BWC Review Conference. This is also an area where we have recently produced a publication entitled Preparing for Success at the 9th Biological and Toxin Weapons Review Conference. You can download this should you wish. There should be a link in the chat box here. We're doing this work because it's particularly important. Although at present it seems unclear when the review conference will take place, it is fairly clear that it will be important for states parties and stakeholders to prepare to make the most of what is a unique opportunity, both to take stock of the past, but also to chart the future course of the Biological Weapons Convention. It is with that in mind that I'm delighted to be joined by three BWC Review Conference veterans, if I may be so bold, who can discuss some of their experiences in these review conferences. First and foremost, I'm delighted to welcome Ambassador Dr. Molnar. Ambassador Molnar is the Special Representative of the Hungarian Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade for Arms Control, Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. He was also the president of the 8th BWC Review Conference and is well placed to provide some unique insights into the preparation and the processes of these important events. Secondly, I would like to introduce Dr. Una Jakob. Una is a research associate at the Peace Research Institute in Frankfurt in Germany, where she specializes in arms control, disarmament and non-proliferation related to chemical and biological weapons. She is also the author of 2 PRIF reports that provide some really quite valuable and detailed reflections on both the 6th and the 7th review conferences. I think light at the end of the tunnel is from the 6th, and then balanced minimalism is from the 7th, if that's correct. Yeah. If my notes are correct, I think it's also right to say that Una has been on the German delegation of the 5th, the 6th, the 7th, and the 8th BWC review conferences, and is therefore well placed to provide insights to these events. Last but no means least, it's my pleasure to welcome Mr. Zahid Rastam. Zahid is Chargé d'Affaires ad interim with the High Commission of Malaysia to the United Kingdom. He was formerly the Deputy Permanent Representative of the Malaysian Permanent Mission in Geneva, and he has particular insights both as a delegate but also a facilitator at review conferences. And if I'm Zahid, please correct me, but if I understand rightly, in 2011 you were the facilitator on science and technology, and in 2016 you were the facilitator on assistance and cooperation, I believe. Thank you all for taking the time to join us at this event, and I'm really delighted you've all agreed to speak. I should make very clear that the 3 panelists are all speaking in their personal capacity. The event itself will take the form of a moderated conversation in which I will put questions to our panelists. Now, I have some warm-up questions to get the event started, but I would encourage you all, please do submit questions. We are quite constrained for time, so rather than take oral interventions, I would encourage you to please use the Q&A function to submit questions or comments. This can be located at the bottom of your screen. One other point on this, if you would like me to attribute the question, please type in your name. Otherwise, we will not attribute comments or questions in the discussion. Participants will not be able to see your questions, but the panelists will. And we will try to get to as many questions as we can, but we make no promises because we do have limited time. So without further ado, I think it's useful to start the discussion, and I'd like to begin with the first set of questions, and perhaps if I could start with you, Ambassador Molnar. So the first question to you would be to sort of, how did you prepare for the 8th review conference in your capacity as president designate? So it'd be good to know what sort of things you did and the resources and time requirements for that process. Please, Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you, Jamie, and good morning, afternoon, or evening to all participants. First of all, I would like to thank you and UNIDIR for organizing this series of meetings helping us to maintain the momentum and prepare ourselves for the next review conference. So in response to your question, let me start by saying that I was in a special position before I got nominated for the position of the president of the 8th Review Conference, because as you yourself mentioned in your introduction, I'm special representative for arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation. So basically, I'm supposed to follow everything related to this very wide area. So prior to the review conference, I was not a specialist on BWC related issues. So my first task was to get an in-depth knowledge of all issues related to the BWC. So what I mean under this means the political aspects, but at the same time, the nitty-gritty of substance and procedure. I also thought that I need to know what went well and what went wrong during previous review conferences, and what were the solutions which worked during the previous review conferences. Also, I thought that I need to know in detail the conduct of all the MSPs and MXPs since the review conference before, so since the 7th review conference. I was in a special situation from a different perspective as well. If I am not mistaken, I am the only BWC RevCo president so far who was not posted to Geneva when he or she performed this job. So I had to go to Geneva very often and try to catch up, not only with the substance, but with the colleagues who deal with this. At the same time, I cannot say that everything was totally new to me, because as you may know, Hungary is the sole sponsor of the United Nations General Assembly resolution on the BWC, and I have been in charge of the preparation and the conduct of informal consultations on the resolution for many years. So I already knew some of the material, and also many of the players who are involved in BWC business. So based on these assumptions, what I need to know, after my nomination, I decided to go to Geneva and participate actively in all the MSPs and MSPs and MXPs, sorry. So I went for the first time in the second part of 14 and 15 and all the meetings up to the review conference. In addition to attending those meetings, during my stay in Geneva, had informal consultations with as many representatives of state parties as possible. And after I became president designate, I had a series of informal consultations with regional groups. I would have to add that in a way, my personal preparation strongly overlapped with the preparation for the review conference itself. And here I need to mention that the preparatory process for the last review conference was a new and innovative one, because this was the first one where the PrepCon wasn't only a short one dealing with procedural issues, but we had 2 stages. We had 1.5 days in April, basically dealing with procedural issues, but also then we had 5 days in August where we tackled substance as well. And listening to the interventions of delegations and following the discussion helped a lot my personal preparation. Let me underline one aspect that according to the mandate, the PrepCom and I was given by the MSP at the end of the second PrepCom. I had to prepare a summary report under my own responsibility. I thought in advance that that would be a thankless task, because probably no one would be satisfied with the summary, and it proved to be true. At the same time, preparing that summary and then listening to the reaction of state parties to that summary also very much helped the preparation for the review conference itself. Finally, I would have to mention that in addition to the formal preparatory process, we had these informal meetings the regional meetings all over the world, plus meetings in individual countries like China or the Russian Federation, which enabled me also to have direct contacts with colleagues who deal with the BWC but don't come to Geneva. So stakeholders from governments and from the regions where we had these meetings, which in a way also widened my perspective. Maybe as the first intervention, I stop here and then I'll let the others to tell what they think about this. Thank you, Jamie.
Well, thank you, Ambassador. It's a remarkable bout of time and energy over nearly more than a 2-year spell there, so it's good to hear about. And I may come back to you on some of the solutions that you mentioned earlier on as well in subsequent questions. Now, perhaps though, if I could turn to Una, I wonder whether you could talk through how you prepared for the 5th, the 6th, the 7th, or the 8th. I'll leave you to take your pick in your capacity as a scientific or technical advisor to the German delegation. Please, Una, you have the floor.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Yes, great. Yes, and I would like to start as well with thanking Jamie and UNIDIR for this event and for inviting me to be part of it. I'm really happy to be here. Yeah, maybe I'll start with the 5th. I actually came in for the second part of the 5th review conference in 2002, so after the big event, and I was quite new in the job, and I don't think I was really prepared for my first multilateral diplomatic meeting, especially in those circumstances. So I'll skip that, and for the rest of this, my comments will focus on the other review conferences, because the 5th was just at least 2002 was just a very special event and very different from the usual review conferences. Well, I guess preparing for a review conference as an expert really depends on what your task as an expert is. If it's to represent the delegation for one specific task in detail, or if it's more to be there and provide support wherever it's needed and useful. And in this case, of course, there are the usual internal preparations with the delegation. That's, I guess, pretty much the same for everybody. As for the rest, I'm in the lucky position that it's actually part of my regular job to keep up with what's going on in the BWC world. So that's what I do anyway. And when it comes to review conference, of course, I take a closer look at all the proposals that are on the table and the positions that various states parties have on these proposals. I also read, yes, that's again a very common thing, the available papers, working papers, position papers, letters, whatever is available, that gives an indication of how the whole preparatory process is going and where we are and what we might expect at the review conference. And review conferences are very difficult to predict, but still there are some expectations that come up during the preparatory process. What I find much easier this time than usual is participating in events in the run-up to the conference. That's at least one small advantage of this whole situation, that so much is taking place online. So it's much easier to attend meetings, workshops, all these things. So I'm sorry. And then what I do as in my role as an advisor, as an expert, is that I usually go back to documents from the previous conferences and previous meetings, the MSP reports, pretty much like Ambassador Molnar just described his preparation, just to recall how the discussions went, what the crucial issues were, what the different positions were. And I also make sure that I read, and that's probably the point that's most different from delegates' preparations, because they probably don't have that much time for that. I do read non-governmental papers, academic papers, all the articles, whatever, because there's usually a whole range of papers out there making proposals for the RevCon, analyzing the state of play and all these things. And I found that really, really useful too, just to get into the mood, so to say, and to see, catch the atmosphere and see where things might be going or might not be going. So it's pretty much a mix of bringing myself up to date with the broad picture and the broader context, and looking into the specific proposals and getting the details ready. So, yeah.
Thank you, Una. And I may come back to you on your point about informal meetings in the run-up to review conferences, and also perhaps on the NGO role as well, to get your views on that. But before I do, perhaps if I could turn to you now, Zahid, and I'd be interested to get your sort of sense of preparations for the Malaysian delegation, but also perhaps get a sense of what the role of the facilitator is and how that worked as well. Please, Mr. Rastrom, you have the floor.
Thank you, James, and Basimona, Una, and everybody else watching. It's a pleasure to be able to join all of you. And to, first of all, thank UNIDIR, James, and your team for inviting me to join this panel. I think this is a great initiative in preparation for the 9th Review Conference. I recall that in previous meetings, when we did have these sorts of meetings, it was only for those in Geneva most of the time. But now the fact that, we have no choice but to go virtual, it actually opens it up for, I think, a wider audience. I think this is really great that this is being done. Before I answer your question, one point that I'd like to share is that the RevCon is the major event of the BWC framework. It brings together basically what all the work that gets done in the intersessional process, whether it is the formal or informal meetings that are part of or relate to the meeting of experts or the meeting of state parties, the discussions that we all have on the side, the events that take place outside of the UN framework, whether it's organized by individual states, by like-minded countries, by civil society, or a mix of the two. All these come together in a very intense sort of 3-week period. Review conferences, they're common. Any sort of treaty has some sort of review conference, whether it's the disarmament treaties or whether it's the human rights treaties and so on. And I've been fortunate to sort of experience, across different types of issues. But BWC, it's something different. I've seen other review conferences in, whether disarmament or human rights or on other types of issues, but BWC, I think it has its own sort of dynamics. It has its own sort of behavior. There's a long history about it. It's a treaty that, because it does not have a verification procedure, sort of shapes and paints maybe in some way, depending on which side you're on, how everything else gets done. So, I think this sort of history and dynamic one needs to understand, and one needs to understand that, when I say that it all comes together, it means that the importance of that review conference is something that you can't underestimate. Whatever may have taken place before, it's important to understand, but the review conference is where sort of the big decisions are made, and where it gets pretty tough and challenging, and one has to be have the stamina and persevere for it, because those 3 weeks are incredibly intense. But to answer your question about preparations in the Malaysian delegation, for me, I've been fortunate to participate both as a delegate coming from capital, as well as somebody who is based in Geneva. And these two dynamics are quite different in terms of how one would approach preparation towards the review conference. On one hand, the preparations that one needs to take as an individual is different. If you're in Geneva, then you have access and you're able to speak with your colleagues from other countries that are based there. So basically, you have access to the state parties when you need to. Whereas if you are a capital-based colleague, your opportunities to meet other people may not be so often. It might be, during regional meetings. It might be during the, MXPs, MSPs. You happen to travel to Geneva, which may not always be the case, or it might be in sort of bilateral discussions. But if one is in capital, these sorts of things happen far less regularly than it would be when you're in Geneva. At the same time, if you are in capital, you also have the responsibility, and I think this applies to anybody from whichever country, you also have the responsibility to sort of coordinate the positions that will come in from the other different agencies. I think generally from what I've seen, most countries, regardless of size, tend to have some sort of interagency process. Whether that interagency process involves 10 or 20 agencies, if it's a bigger country, or maybe just 2 or 3 if one comes from a small country. But there is a process of consultation that needs to take place back home. So what this means, I think, is that whether one comes from capital and you have that responsibility of coordinating the interagency process back home, or whether you're from Geneva and you have the responsibility of understanding and speaking and having conversations with other state parties, it all comes together to ensure that one's own national delegation is prepared as a collective, so that you have a strategy in place, you have clear positions in place, so and you have those positions so that you can achieve the objectives that you want. This is quite basic in the sense of, I think, you know, those of us in this business, we know that, you know, you have to prepare, you have to negotiate, you have to understand. But just to go into some specifics, in the BWC process, I think you have to identify the issues. There are some issues which I think if, you know, one were to read the various documents of the review conference, the MXPs and MSPs, you know already those must be important because they're there all the time. S&T, international cooperation, international assistance, response, national implementation. So I think if, say, one is new or one is familiar with it, in either way, I think it's quite clear that these are important issues that you focus on, which means that reading up on those documents and understanding what those documents mean on these different subjects. There are issues that may come up, and then there are the details of the issues that may come up. Give one example of S&T. S&T is there in the treaty, it's there in the review conference. There's always an S&T subject in the ISPs, I think for the past 3 ISPs since the 6th review conference. So you know S&T is there, but the difference is that the proposals for it are different. You know, there are proposals that talk about an institutional mechanism that, you know, there might be some similarities, but there might be differences as well, cutting across review conferences. There's also the language within the text. If you look at the language from this 7th review conference in 2011, it identified certain types of S&T developments at that time, which the state parties felt were important, and it was reflected in the review conference document as things that the ISP for 2012, 13, 14, 15 had to look into. So that was then. Although in 2016 we didn't have a similar document, but in the discussions on S&T, it was looking at something else. It was looking at more of a mechanism sort of setup as opposed to the specific topics. And same thing when it comes to international cooperation, assistance, national implementation. There might be similarities, you know, across meetings, MXPs, MSPs, and review conferences, but there are also sort of nuanced differences. And I think whether you're from capital or whether you're in Geneva, really look into those and identify the differences, because that evolution of the issues, I think, goes a long way in terms of understanding the dynamics and how that would play out at the review conference. History is quite important. The previous understandings, the review conference documents, that evolution that I spoke of. Knowing the language and the text, again, looking at the documents, because as we all know in these sort of UN documents, past and agreed language usually forms a basis of future agreement. So you need to know what is there. And going back to the dynamics, just on this point, looking at the documents is insufficient. I say that because although we need to understand it, we need to look at the papers, we need to look at all the different documents. But the BWC is very much a political process in nature. The review conference is political. And statements that countries give, and these statements you can find on the UNIDIR website, they do not always give an accurate picture of how states will behave. You know, a lot of countries will say that what we say as a statement is our principles, but then how they behave in terms of what they can or cannot agree to during the actual negotiations, they will say, well, this is part of the dynamic. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think, again, it's part of diplomacy. It's how these dynamics work. I've experienced and I've seen quite a few colleagues who come from more technical or scientific backgrounds who have become frustrated with how they see the diplomats behave. And I understand that frustration, but I think we have to understand that because it is a political process and mostly negotiated by diplomats, sometimes perhaps the science and the logic and the rationale takes second to political considerations. It's not the best sort of ideal way of things, but it's a reality which I think everyone needs to accept. And then coming again about this dynamic, for those in capital and not aware of BWC meetings, it's difficult to have the conversations because of what I mentioned before, but that's where the Geneva-based people come in. Geneva-based people, you have to be sure that you speak with your colleagues. I think if you are in Geneva, you have an advantage in the sense of you're able to build that trust and confidence and to get to know people. When I did the 2011 review conference, I had no prior BWC experience. I showed up at the review conference and I read some documents, but I didn't know anyone. My work prior to that had been on human rights issues. So the BWC was actually my first disarmament meeting. But just to tie in as an anecdote to how I became a facilitator, it just so happened that the chairman of the Committee of the Whole at that time in 2011, Ambassador Disarmament of Indonesia, I had met him when I was doing third committee work in New York. When I was vice chair of the third committee and I was chairing the third committee at one time. He had showed up, and when I saw him a few years later in Geneva, I did what all diplomats tend to do. We get all polite and say to people, Ambassador, if you need any help, we're more than willing to assist. Most of the time, ambassadors will just take that and let you go. This time he actually took me up on the offer and said, well, if that's the case, then I'm going to tell Paul van der IJssel, and he did. And then I spoke with Paul van der IJssel, who was the president of the RevCon in 2011. And he said, well, Destra spoke to me about you, so, would you want to facilitate an S&T? And, at that point, I couldn't say no because I was the one who offered myself up. And that's how I got into it. But even though it was new, what helped was prior to coming up to the BWC, as a delegate from Capital, I had many conversations with my colleague who was based in Geneva, asking, what are things like? What are the main issues? What are people like? Because it's important to understand the personalities. So if you're in Capital, make sure that you encourage your colleagues in Geneva to get to know people and understand. I've spoken sometime. I can continue maybe later. You had a question about what it's like being a facilitator and how you prepare for that. And maybe I'll come back the second time because I think I've spoken enough at this point.
No, thank you, Zahid. I think there's some fascinating and frank insights, which I think may have raised a smile in your co-panelists, some of your remarks there. I was particularly taken by your point, you're stressing the importance of the review conference, the intensity of the review conference and some of those challenges, and I think that's useful to keep in mind. Along with the point you raised on interagency preparation and discussion, I think that's useful points to raise, so thank you. I'm starting to see a couple of questions appear in the Q&A box. I'll get to those shortly. Please do continue to submit questions. I will get to as many as I can, but I want to move to a second question, and it's essentially the same question to all three panelists. And it's a two-part question as well. So I suppose really this relates to particular lessons that you learned or advice from your experience as a president, a delegate, a facilitator, but also, and I think we've already touched upon this, what advice would you give to incoming delegates or office holders? Perhaps if I could start with you, Una, at this point, and then we'll change the order a little bit, and then I'll go to Zahid and then Ambassador Molnar, if that's okay. Please, Una, you have the floor.
Sure. Thanks for those questions. Yeah, well, I think several of the things I would tell about my own lessons that I learned and advice I give tie in with what's been said already and what we said in the first round. Preparation is essential. I think there's hardly any need to explain that any further. Actually, I needed to learn that bringing in proposals at the review conference might not be the best idea because it might be a bit late. Of course, it's always possible to bring in ideas and to bring in submit working papers and all that. Actually, we've done that during the review conference too. But if you really want to get an idea out there and get attention and have it included in the discussions, then you need to start much earlier than that. Like the PrepCom probably be the latest point to get proposals really truly into the whole process, because of course everybody else is preparing on the basis of papers that are out there. And most delegations will need to discuss that internally and all that. So that's maybe one thing. And I think, as I said earlier, and Said also mentioned that, I think it's very important and helpful to be familiar with previous documents, not just from the BWC, but also related documents like UN resolutions and all that. And actually, I found something in my office that I wanted to bring with you. Some of them might still remember. That's the briefing book. And I know, Jamie, you want to come back to NGO, the role of NGOs. I don't know if you can see how thick it is, and how massive. That's a briefing book that several NGO people, and I know at least one of them is out there, I think, hey, Richard, prepared for the 7th review conference. And that actually contains, I mean, that looks intimidating. There's no need to memorize all that what's in there. I just thought it would be nice to show it. That contains the previous final declarations, a number of UN resolutions, and documents like the international health regulations and a number of other things. And of course, it's not really very useful to carry around massive amounts of paper, but I actually usually keep many tabs open in my internet browser while I'm in Geneva. So it's really helpful to have all these documents somewhere in the back to check, because many people who are really deep in the discussions will just make passing references to resolution numbers, or sometimes a resolution number could be a way of finding compromise when delegates can't agree on whether or not how to refer to a certain mechanism or something like that. So I think that's useful. I think Sahin mentioned that as well. I think it's important, especially when you're new in the field, to get familiar with the BWC's history. I mean, even though it's like the protocol negotiations ended almost 20 years ago, that still casts a very long shadow on any meeting. So I think it's just important to understand that, because without that, you can't understand some of the dynamics and some of the, maybe even some of the paragraphs in documents that look very, well, full of words, and you can't really grasp the meaning unless you know that it's a way of circumscribing something related to verification or something like that. But at the same time, I think it's important to understand, but it's also important to move on. So I wouldn't say that it's useful to dwell on the past all the time. It's just important to understand it, but it's also important to get beyond that. And yeah. One thing that's close to my BWC heart is the role of the final declaration. That's very specific now. I think it's quite easy from the outside to underestimate the role of the article by article review and the final declaration part of the final document, because that contains words more or less and not much action. But so often I think people tend to focus on the forward-looking elements, because that's of course what will keep everybody busy for the coming years, and that's where practical decisions need to be made. But I think the final declaration, well, both as a political scientist, I would say that that contains the interpretations and common understandings, and that actually means something. But also in terms of practice, it takes up quite some negotiation time and energy. So I think it's really worthwhile to keep that in mind and to prepare for that as well, and not just for the more easy to grasp practical forward-looking elements. Yes, and maybe if I talk about specifics just out of experience, and I certainly won't be giving advice to delegates how to internally prepare. I mean, that's you know that better than I, what's necessary, but just maybe something to keep in mind is the finances, because we actually had a situation once where quite late into the conference. Some states parties had to leave consensus, so to say, or had to stand up or come forward and say, we're really, really sorry, but we can't go on with that because we don't have clearance on finance on the increase of the budget. So I think it's in really, really practical terms, it's helpful to clarify that and maybe collect arguments for people back home why it might be necessary and helpful to talk about that. Now that gets, as I said, that gets very specific now, and of course it depends on what's at stake at the review conference, but it's just because we were asked about experiences, and that struck me as something I hadn't expected, hadn't considered before, so that's why I thought I could as well share it here. Yeah, I think that's about it for now. I'm happy to come back on that if there are any further questions.
Okay, thank you. No, I think there's quite a lot of food for thought there and preparations moving forward. I was particularly struck by your point that the submission of proposals at the review conference is often quite difficult, because that means that good ideas don't necessarily get attention. The importance of understanding the history and the politics, and then I think your point on finances is also really important given what happened in 2011, the sort of shocks. I think that's really useful, so thank you. Perhaps if I could turn to you with the same question, Ambassador Molnar. So sort of lessons that you've learned and advice to incoming office holders or delegates. Please, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Jamie. In a way, my answers to your questions overlap, because what I have learned is basically the same as my advice to the delegates and office holders, but I will try to divide it and group it. And first of all, I would like to repeat and underline what Una said. The preparation should start as early as possible. And it seems that 3 weeks for the review conference are long, but at the same time, it is very intense. So we should be able to solve as many problems prior to the conference as possible. And when it comes to proposals, concrete proposals, the sooner they are submitted, the more time delegations have to study them and formulate their position on them. So you cannot do it during the review conference. If you look back to the last review conference and you check the number of the proposals, you realize what an enormous task is that. As an office holder, it's very important that you should work with all state parties in a transparent, inclusive, and constructive manner. Also, personal contacts help. You need to establish these personal contacts prior to the review conference itself, because by that time you need to have such personal contacts which might help you out when you face a difficult situation. Also, another lesson I've learned is that it's very important to work closely with the ISU, rely on the information and the advice they give to you as a president or any of the office holders. They are very capable, knowledgeable, and willing to help. It was again a special case with me, since I was not based in Geneva. So we had to do a lot of things through correspondence, and it still worked. So I cannot overemphasize the importance of this one, the excellent support they can provide to you. Also, for the president and the office holders, you have to be an honest broker. You have to be open to listen to all delegations. You should be able to project the impression that the position of each and every state party is equally important to you, and you try to find a fine balance which satisfies everyone. If you don't have the trust of the delegations, you are not able to reach progress. Also, especially in light of the outcome of the last review conference, I would say that it's important to manage expectations. You have to balance ambition with realism. When I listened to assessment of the outcome of the last review conference, many people compare the outcome to the number of proposals, the number of working papers, and the number of participants. But as Una said, you need to read all these things carefully. And when you find out that what are absolute priorities to one group of states, if at the same time they are absolute red line for other group of states, you are in a difficult situation, regardless of the number of proposals and the number of working people. So you have to keep in mind the political constraints, because at the end of the day, the delegations need to have the political will to make concessions and to settle on a consensus compromise outcome. So maybe this is the way I summarize the lessons I've learned, but let me say a few words about as advice to delegates. I guess we are in a special situation because of the pandemic, because there is an increased attention to the BWC, to the biological threats and all the problems they can cause. I realized that in terms of organizing the PrEP Commander Review Conference, it creates difficulties. At the same time, it creates some opportunity. And we should try and seize this opportunity to make a progress for the WEC to strengthen the relevance of the convention. Also, an advice to delegates, try to think and work on a cross-regional basis. It started to some extent during the last review conference, but we only had a very limited number of exemptions for that. So if you are able to create proposals, working papers supported by countries coming from different regions, it helps you to overcome the block mentality. Moving on to some advice to office holders, it's very important for the office holders to work as a team, regardless of the regional groups they come from and regardless of their national position. It is always the intention, the president, to bring in people from different backgrounds. So in a way, they represent different positions. If they can work together, it sends a positive message to delegations and helps them also to come to a conclusion. Concerning the outcome, the office holders needs to be ambitious. At the same time, they need to keep in mind the constraints. And what is important that early on, they should identify the most problematic areas and issues. And they need to focus on them from the very beginning, even prior to the review conference. Also, the office holders have to keep in mind that although they have an important role to create the condition and to facilitate the work, at the end of the day, it is the state parties who have to agree. So it is again a fine balance, and there are two sides of the coin. And regarding the outcome, especially it is important for the president, but also for the office holders, they from the very beginning need to have a plan E, B, and sometimes a plan C. So probably the plan E should be, not probably, this is definitely the case, it should be the most ambitious one, and it should be shared with delegations early on, probably by the end of the first week of the REFCON. But then, while pushing it relentlessly, whatever is the reaction, you have to work on some plan B. And as it was the case last time around, you have to have, unfortunately, a plan C, what you put on the paper as the president, as something which should save the conference. So I stop here now. Thank you.
Thank you. I think there's some wise words there. So thank you, Ambassador Molnar, on the points of across regional discussion on seizing the opportunity, on success, and on identifying problems and issues earlier. And the point on plan A, B, and C, I think it's also very useful as well. Thank you. We're starting to get some questions emerging, but before I go to those, if I could turn to Yuzahid, please, the same question to yourself, but welcome your views on that.
Thanks, James. I agree with both what Basimona and Una said. It's important in terms of preparations. I think they went through some of the things that you need to do when you prepare for that. For example, as a facilitator, I mean, some of the things that I can share is that you have to work closely with whoever the president is. In my case, in 2011, it was Ambassador van der Ijssel. I had only met him at the review conference at that time, but fortunately we got along well, and it was quite clear in terms of, although I represent my country and we had our own positions, but he had his objectives as the president. So once one becomes a facilitator, you somewhat have to take yourself out of that comfort zone of representing your country, but you are sort of working with and for the president of that conference. To fast forward to 2016, when it came to when Ambassador Molnar was president. By that time, I was a bit more seasoned in sort of the BWC framework, and I had met by that time Ambassador Molnar a few times already through different disarmament meetings. So when it came about that he, was the candidate, the president designate, I think the official sort of designation as president wasn't until the review conference when he was elected, but he was the president. So all throughout 2016, I made sure that, and he made sure and had discussions about, whatever sort of objective that he had and the vision that he had in terms of what would be success at the review conference. That was something that, for me as a facilitator, I had to be sort of on the same boat as him. I had my views as representing my country, but at the same time I've worked with the president. But I think that applies to anything. One cannot be a facilitator and expect to do something that would be separate from what all the other facilitators or the president does. It comes to one whole document, and everybody needs to be on the same page in terms of how to do that. So it is important to work together and to assist each other. But in terms of the actual preparation, it's the same thing. You need to know, for example, if one is a facilitator in any sort of given subject, what the agreements were in the past. And those are the sort of things that would likely form the basis of an agreement in the future. So again, the same sort of regular preparations that you do for this review conference as a delegate in your national capacity, you would also have to do so as a facilitator. It's a job that takes time. It counts as additional to your job as a representative of your own state. But nonetheless, it is something that I think is worthwhile, especially if one has a objective, which is to seek success and something that works out collectively for all the state parties. I would say that talking to people, I mentioned that before, Una's mentioned it, Ambassador Molnar has mentioned it, it is super important. One of the things, if one is able to do it, is to the extent possible, at least have conversation with everyone. In 2016, for Malaysia, I think we were quite fortunate because we happened to chair the 2015 meeting of state parties. So as part of our work in 2015, the state parties at that time, I believe, was in November 2015. But from April, we were having conversations with people. We would sort of stack up meetings at the Delegates Cafe and the Serpentine Lounge in Geneva, and just when I say stack, we arrange for 20-minute meetings. So in 1 hour we get 3. So we get about 10 or 20 a day. And these in April, May, June, it was just simple conversations of, we want success, we look forward for success, and we seek your support. As diplomats, everybody's going to say, yes, we agree with you. Yes, we want success. At this stage, it's not trying to find agreement. At this stage, it's just building up rapport. But as you get closer to, say, back then, as you got closer to the August meeting of experts, or in the September and October in the run-up to the meeting of state parties, that's when you get more detail. And that's when the conversations change from being diplomatic niceties to specifics. But that's the thing, you can't get to the specifics unless you build that trust. And that trust is important. So whether you're a delegate from capital, or your delegate from Geneva, you need to build that trust. In capital, you have to depend on your Geneva-based colleagues. And if, I noticed there was a question in the chat that said, what if delegates don't have enough technical support from capital? That can happen. Even in sort of our own national experience, we had, experts on some subjects, but then maybe on some other subjects, we did not have experts who had as much skill as compared to other countries. That didn't stop us, because I think that, it required extra work instead of doing your own research and building your own expertise. But you need to understand enough of the dynamic, I think, so that when one engages in conversation, that you add value to the conversation, because there's a lot of talk that takes place, but having to sort of filter that talk to find what's important and what can add to the process, that takes time, that takes effort. But I don't think that having lack or not enough technical support from capital should prevent anyone from engaging in the discussions. At the end of the day, if your country is a state party, you have every right, no matter what size what size is your country or how powerful do you think you are equal as anyone else, which I think it differs because, say for NPT, you have the nuclear weapon states who have sort of a special status in that context. In the Council of CWC, it's based on strength or how much of the chemical industries have. And some other treaties have that too. BWC doesn't have that. We're actually technically all the same. One vote, one voice sort of process. So that's where everybody needs to engage and everybody needs to. I don't think lack of support in any way should prevent that.
Thank you, Zahid. Once again, there's some rich food for thought there, and greatly appreciated. I was particularly taken by your point. I think it's words to the effect of you can't get to the specifics without trust and without building that rapport, which kind of leads me to one of the questions which has been submitted to the chat. And that relates to the issue of COVID and how that may have an effect on some of the preparations. Now, I know Una earlier on said it's great because we can have much more online interaction, but I do wonder, and it is a question to all three of you really, how do you think the pandemic might influence the proceedings, but also how do you think it might have an effect on that process of building rapport through informal and often in-person meetings in the past? And I'll open the floor to anybody on that one. Just to give you a heads up as well, we have a couple of questions related to the politics of the review conference, what constitutes success, and then points raised about technical support, and I'll come to those afterwards. But firstly, general thoughts on COVID, how might this influence the proceedings and the build up, the preparatory work? Anybody wish to take the floor? Ambassador Zahid, please.
Ambassador first. Okay. Just
doesn't matter.
It's easy for me to say because I'm not working on disarmament issues anymore up until a few months ago. But my on this is that if it is possible to get an in-person meeting, that would be the best. I think it would be very, very challenging to the point of almost impossible to come up with a document, with an outcome document that would get everyone's support if that document was simply done online or through a hybrid process. An online process means that somebody has to draft it, then you send it out, you wait for people to give feedback. But I think any of us who have worked in that sort of format know that when you get sort of comments, say from different sources on a given document, somebody will have to go through that. And whoever that is, whether that's the president, whether that's the secretariat in support of the president, or whether that is a facilitator appointed by the president, they'll have to pick and choose. And once they pick and choose that document and send it out, there will be countries, there will be state parties that will be unhappy with it, and they will question, why is it that my comment was in, but theirs is not? How did you choose? And it's really hard to sort of explain that if you're an office holder, if you're the president. It's really hard to get a satisfactory answer if you're a delegate and you have to answer to your superiors at home. So it's difficult. So to simply answer that question about how the COVID pandemic will impact the review conference in terms of process, to the extent possible that it can take place in a full format, in my personal view, I think that's the best. Of course, there are questions then that, what does that mean? Does that mean you delay from 2021 to 2022? I think that's up to all the state parties to decide. But my take on it is that it's very difficult to have something like the review conference in that sort of format. There are just too many issues that one has to deal with and discuss that you're not able to fully examine and engage with if it is done through an online format. In terms of the substance, however, I'm sure people will raise about the fact of how the BWC or how COVID-19 ties into BWC. I think this is where we have to be careful. WHO I think most countries are very clear that this is a pandemic virus that is natural in terms of its origin. BWC looks at biological weapons, although we look at things related to naturally occurring at times. But there's a danger here where if we try to put it in the BW, COVID, and look at it from a biological weapons sort of perspective, we have to be very careful for that, because I don't think that one would want or should give any sort of ammunition to discussions that could lead into xenophobia, discussions that could lead to false accusations and so on. I mean, if we want to look at it in terms of how we can deal, how the COVID experience can help us in dealing with the future pandemic, I think that's okay, but not for finger pointing. And that, I think, is a very careful thing that one needs to look at and be mindful of.
Thank you, Zahid. Sorry, Ambassador Molnar, please.
Okay, I agree with Zahid that the pandemic has an impact both on substance and on procedure. Concerning substance, optimally, the impact can also be a positive one, because the pandemic hopefully helps us to enhance the relevance of the BWC and draw attention of state parties to biological risks and to the need to tackle them. So it could give an impetus to the review conference and to our work. At the same time, as Zahid also mentioned, it might bring up some controversial issues, might be not directly related to the BWC itself, but to the pandemic and the origins and the responses and things like that, international cooperation. And ideally, it wouldn't have an effect on our discussions, but knowing what has happened already in earlier meetings, it is unfortunately not absolutely sure. It's not going to come. Concerning procedure, basically the role of the review conference is not only to review the implementation by state parties, but also to summarize the intersessional process. And we have already seen the postponement of meeting of experts, meeting of state parties. We don't exactly know when they can be held and when the review conference will take place. So there are a number of uncertainties. In my first intervention, tried to emphasize the importance of the preparations for the review conference and the preparatory process and the prep itself. As long as we don't know when we exactly have the review conference, when the preparatory committee meeting or meetings will be held, how can we organize our work, it would have a negative effect. Concerning the format, I agree with Zahid that ideally it should be a full-fledged and in-person review conference for the reasons he mentioned. And the only question is, and I very much hope it's not going to be the case, that if there is no relief in the pandemic situation and we have to postpone because the conditions don't allow us to have a full-fledged in-person conference, whether at a certain point the assessment changes, that it's better to have some kind of a hybrid format than to postpone it by 1, 2, or 3 years. I say that when at the same time fully realize the complications caused by a hybrid format. So hopefully it can be held in a full-fledged in-person way, and we will see exactly when. I stop there.
Thank you, Ambassador. Una, please, did you want to take the floor? Please.
Yes, thanks. Yes, well, especially in terms of procedure, there's really not much to add to what my colleagues just said. And of course, yes, I was trying to point out some slight advantage of the situation, but I think in terms of preparations, it's really helpful to have virtual meetings, especially for maybe smaller delegations or incoming delegates to have more access to information. But when it comes to informal meetings and discussions on positions and exchange of views, I think personal meetings are much more helpful and essential. In terms of substance, I also agree with what's been said earlier, that I think it will, the pandemic will have an impact. There are so many topics, and we've seen in recent years that health-related topics have become more prominent in the BWC discourse anyway, even before the situation. And I think it's natural. There is a natural connection, of course, but I still think it's important to keep in mind that the BWC is a disarmament treaty and is not designed to enhance emergency assistance and things like that beyond where it's directly connected with the disarmament and then security aspect. Something maybe that I would like to add here, and that's very much coming from my researcher perspective and not from realistic expectations for the review conference, but maybe something I would like to see discussed, and not really what I expect to see discussed, is a different angle on that. And I think Zahid mentioned the risk of allegations and heightened tensions and all that. And I think that could take us to looking more closely at transparency measures and all that. And not for this situation maybe now, but if we think that some kind of outbreak and maybe even more ambiguous regarding the source may happen again or will happen again at some point. And I think to prevent misperceptions and allegations and tensions just in that context, it would be helpful. I think here the BWC could actually play a really useful role in increasing transparency about state activities, about lab activities, about all that, and that actually would take the BWC back to its arms control core, because one of the core principles of arms control and disarmament treaties is risk reduction and avoidance of misperceptions that might lead to well, arms races in the biological case. That's a long shot, and I'm not saying I expect that, but still we all know about the dual use problem and the lack of transparency and biodefense activities that may lead to suspicions and all that. And I think that's where the BWC could play a really useful role if transparency, information exchange, confidence and compliance would be enhanced. Yeah, just to avoid additional problems in future situations like that.
Thank you, Anna. I'll use the point which I think all of you have raised about the sort of a degree of caution in making the connection between COVID and the BWC. But it does lead me to a slightly tricky set of questions around politics and the Biological Weapons Convention. And there are a couple of questions which have been submitted on this. One has been directed towards Ambassador Molnar, and it relates to whether you think the negative developments in other forum could have some influence on the had some influence on the BWC. And I think there's perhaps a wider question there about interlinkages between the BWC and wider events and developments. And then there's a second question related to politics, which is in the polarized environment. How do you navigate the political and technical hurdles and complexities? And is it possible to find ways forward regardless of the politics? And if so, if you could tell us how to do that, that would be gratefully appreciated. Anybody want to take the floor on any of those questions? One's directed to you, Ambassador, first of all, perhaps.
Okay. I fully agree that the review conference of the BWC, but the review conference of any other international treaty doesn't take place in a vacuum. So the international environment, the relations between state parties and especially the major players have an effect on the conduct and the outcome of the BWC review conference. At the same time, I wouldn't say that this is overwhelmingly influencing the situation. It's equally important what is the position of the state parties and the key players on the issue itself, in this case, the BWC. So in a way, if the international security or overall international situation is strained, it might have a negative effect. At the same time, it might give an opportunity to participants to show some positive development. So it can be, it can work both ways. And it very much depends on what is the position on the concrete issue. So again, I already mentioned earlier the political will, and it plays an important role. How the parties arrive to the negotiating table, whether they think that they need to stick to their position, and if their position is not accepted, in that case, they are ready to sacrifice the success, or are they willing to compromise because they say that it's important to deliver. So it's a very complicated issue. There is an effect, but at the same time, I wouldn't say it's decisive. Coming concretely to the last review conference, it took place in 2016, and the year prior to that, we had the MPT review conference, which was not able to agree on an outcome document. But I don't think that it had a direct effect on the conduct of the BWC review conference and the outcome. I stop here.
Thank you, Ambassador. Did anybody else want to take the floor on those two questions? Sorry, Zahid, please.
Thank you, James. I agree very much with what Ambassador Molnar said. People, it depends what they want out of success. Unfortunately, we've seen situations where people are willing to sort of burn it all down if they didn't get what they want. And that, I think we have to be mindful that might still exist at the Ninth Review Conference. Does that mean that one should be pessimistic about the chances of success? I don't think we should. I think we have to be optimistic, and I think we have to be prepared to give it our all up until the end to get something good. But the politics of it is such that you have to give and take. So I think if it's understood very early on by the president, by the office holders, by the secretary, as well as the delegations, and if it can be identified, the delegations that have sort of major issues, if it can be identified early on amongst the sort of major delegations about, what would you consider success and what you are willing to give and take. If that can be understood early on, it's easier to get a conclusion and easier to get something that gets consensus. Of course, during the review conference itself, people will position. They will make statements that are tough, will make statements to say that we will only accept certain things, that without certain items in the outcome document, we will not be able to have an outcome document. Some of that is positioning, it's grandstanding, it's part of the game, unfortunately. But one really needs to understand that. And the only way you can understand that is being able to approach those delegations and asking them, we understand your position, we understand that you need to say this. Are you really going to stick to it? Or is this something that you think perhaps you can compromise? And you talk with that with one side, you talk with that with the other side, and somewhere in between you can find the sort of middle ground. It sounds, pretty sort of dirty politics, but unfortunately it becomes that way. Because if we were to look at it solely from logic, solely from the technical merits of an individual proposal, we are not going to get that far. Ambassador Molnar initially mentioned A, B, and C, the sort of different proposals. You have something which is very ambitious, something which is more modest, and then something which is pared down. That usually takes place, and that takes place behind the scenes, but one needs to have those options available at the end. There are situations, however, where delegations do not want success at all, and they're willing to burn it all down. I think this is where if it can be identified, those delegations which are doing that early on, I think someone needs to sort of speak to them and understand them, and then try to find out the middle ground. But in no way should that be a deterrence to trying to seek solutions. I think there's a responsibility of all state parties to work honestly, negotiate honestly, to find success. There may be one or two that make things more difficult, but I think some empathy in trying to understand their point of view is also necessary, and to try to accommodate them, because having that is better than a situation where there is no outcome document. To the extent possible, we should try to avoid that.
Thank you, Zaid. Once again, wise words, I think there. I'm quite curious about the mentions of Plan A, B, and C. Leads me to another one of the questions which has been raised in the Q&A chat function. And this is by Richard Guthrie, who's a sort of long-standing BWC roving reporter. But Richard raises the question, and it kind of links to the point of what would Plan A look like, what would Plan B look like, and what would Plan C look like. And Richard asked the question of how do we understand success or failure when it comes to a review conference? Is it simply having a consensus final document to success? And Ambassador Molnar touched upon this. But I'll hand this first to Una, if I may. So Dr. Jakob, please, do you want to take this? And then I'll pass it to others as well. Please, Una.
Sure. I wish I could present Plan A or B here, but the question about if success is just having a consensual review final document, well, I think not having one would hardly qualify as success, I guess. But we have heard views in the past saying that no document might be better than having a bad document, whatever one considers a bad document. But I think something that would backtrack from achievements we already had, for example, would certainly not be desirable. So I think it's not just the question of do we have a final document or do we not, but so I think it's difficult to find a general, like put it in one phrase, what would be success or what would be a failure. I think there are some substantive issues that I personally would consider successes or failures. Like, for example, not extending the ISU would certainly be a major failure. It would be a pity if we, like, there are not many subjects that we have where consensus seems reachable. And so if we let those opportunities slip, that would be, I think, very disappointing too. In general, the last review conference was very much polarized. I mean, all review conferences have been polarized, of course. And I think there was another question, has it always been that politicized? I think it has always been politicized to varying degrees, but in general, I think it's part of the BWC setup to have two major, poles. I don't know if that's the right word here, but so I don't have a definite answer what would be the success or failure. I think it's much easier to comment on that in hindsight than before the review conference has even started. But it's certainly not having a final, and I used to think that it would be really, really bad if we didn't have a final document, but having witnessed the last conference and knowing that it's not impossible to actually have to go back from what we had achieved previously, I think success would be to move forward, not keep the status quo as it is, but to move forward. And then, of course, we have to discuss what forward would be, but just to like for the BWC community to recognize that the world has moved on, that there are issues that need to be tackled to keep the BWC relevant, like scientific and technological developments. I mean, there's broad agreement that they are there, they are very rapid, and they are relevant to the BWC. So I think taking into account these realities that would be necessary, I think, to have success, and not taking them into account would be failure. But beyond that, I wouldn't really dare to predict anything or give an assessment at this point in time. I think it's just too early.
Thank you. And does anybody else want to put forward what Plan A, B, C would look like? Ambassador Molnar, you're muted, I believe.
Yeah, I'm back. Sorry. So since I mentioned Plan A, B, and C, I would come in. But before doing so, I wanted to say that a lot depends on how you qualify a success of a review conference, whether success equals to a consensus outcome document, or you can score some partial success without an outcome document. And I think that it also differs between different treaties, because in my previous contribution mentioned the MPT, and I did so because in the question you quoted it was explicitly referred to. So I think that, for instance, there is a difference between the MPT and the BWC in this respect, because in case of the MPT, you have a preset review process. You have the review conference, and the next year you don't have a meeting, and then you have 3 subsequent years, 3 prepcoms, and again in the 5th year you have the next refcom. In case of the BWC, in the outcome document, you have to, in the forward-looking part, agree on the intersessional program, how you conduct, what is the mandate of the MXPs, how you deal with the emerging problems. If you cannot agree on an outcome document, you don't have an intersessional program. So that is why it differs treaty by treaty. So from that perspective, it's essential to have an outcome document in case of the BWC. And even still, before going to plan E, B, and C, the situation at the last review conference was different from the usual one, because frankly speaking, in most of the cases, you always try to improve. But if it's not possible to improve, the fallback is to a rollover of the previous program. But when we approached the last review conference, it turned out that for one group of states, the intersessional program was satisfactory. And for another group of states, whether they said it publicly or not, the existing one was not acceptable. So in a way, they got the approach that either we have something better, or maybe if we don't mind having anything. So you had to find a way out of that one. So, and this brings me to the ABC plan. At least in our case, last time around, we had plan A, which was an ambitious new intersessional program, also consisting of the review of the article review of the implementation of the concerns coming out of the committee of the whole. And then we had a little bit more modest version of that one. But what finally happened was, because it seemed that it was not possible to reach an agreement on the intersessional part, to save the day by giving one more year to state parties to think about it, whether they really want to stick to their position, or they're ready to accept that the 5 years between the 2 review conferences will pass without any intersessional program. And in a way, it worked, because during the year between the review conference and the next MSP, excellently chaired by India, they rethink their position and they came to the MSP with a more flexible position, and this enabled us to agree on the document. So that's why I say that you have to start ambitiously. You have to push it up to the last moment, maybe try to change it here or there, which is plan B. But if at the end of the day it turns out that it doesn't work, you need to have something in your pocket which you give to state parties as your proposal, which would save the day. And that's what happened the very last afternoon of the last review conference. Thank you.
Thank you. That was insightful. And good to hear more about that. Thank you very much. And Zahid, did you want to take the floor on this issue as well, on the plan A, B, and C, or expectations of what success would look like?
In terms of success, I agree with Ambassador. I also agree with Una. If it's something that rolls back and is not good, and perhaps not having something at all is better. I believe that, but I also think that we need to start and push for the ambitious part a bit, but recognizing and knowing what is recognizing what is possible and seeing how we can work within those parameters. The only thing I'd like to mention about the A, B, and C sort of concept, I mean, for anybody that is coming in later on for the 9th review conferences, don't actually let delegations know you have an A, B, and C. I think with Ambassador Molnar, I mean, we're talking about it now, Ambassador, but this is 5 years after it happened. So I think it's a bit okay now. This is more of looking at history. But at the time, I was working with Ambassador as one of his facilitators, and it was important, I think, for the Ambassador and for me as one of his facilitators, as well as others that were assisting the Ambassador, that what was shown to delegations was the most ambitious that you can get. Unfortunately, of course, behind the scenes, you have to sort of make compromises, and you have to have backups. That's why the sort of A, B, and C different types came up. But you don't want to start that off, because if you start off with that, then delegations who are less ambitious will definitely go for the less ambitious options. So it has to be made clear from the beginning and up until the end that the most ambitious is what, as a whole, collectively, the state parties in the review conference need to try to get. It's only at the last minute, and Ambassador Molnar mentioned, the final afternoon. If I recall, that final afternoon ended at 5:30. So if the A, B, and C didn't come out until like 1:30, it was lunchtime. After the morning session, and there were lots of different discussions, and the ambassador sort of suspended the meeting, for lunch, or so that people go for lunch. But a few of us were sort of in the back with him, trying to sort of draft things, and that kept on going. And it was very long process, but it was something that only came out at the final bit, because you need to push it as much as you can, as right up until the end. And there were times I recall on the night before, and that early morning, we heard indications that, oh, this allocation can support or cannot support, or they want this change or that change. It's you take that into account, of course, in when you're drafting sort of the final document. But there needed to be a clear picture, because there are times some of that is just a smoke show, it's a smoke screen for delegations to try to push certain objectives that they want. So they'll say they'll support this, but they'll not support that. But one needs to be able to sort of look and see past that.
Thank you again. I think it's really informative. Thank you, Zaid. I want to move on. We've got about 6 or 7 minutes left, and there are a couple more sort of sets of questions which I'd like to turn to. One of these relates to technical support, which I think has been touched upon before, but there's also a question around what NGOs and academics could usefully do, and there are a couple of points here which I'll cluster together. So it's a question of, again, from Richard Guthrie: what can we as a community interested in the control of biological weapons do to support non-specialist delegates? There's a question related to the briefing book you held up in the 2011 briefing book, which relates, what is the influence of civil society in the BWC proceedings, and can you identify proposals that were put forward? I think generally it'd be quite interesting for some of the listeners here perhaps to get a sense of what you think could be useful, what academics, NGOs, civil society actors could usefully do in preparation or in support of a successful outcome. And that's an open question to anybody who would like to take that. Una, please.
Yes, it's a strange situation, being an academic, having been on the delegation to answer that question, but maybe it's just a good situation to do that. Well, I think if I wrote down a list of points or of things that NGOs could do or how they could support BWC meetings, that would be quite long, but in view of the time, I'll keep it short. I think the BWC, well, what we call NGO, I mean, in the BWC community, the community is rather small, and I think there is a lot of interaction, direct interaction with delegations, which is, as far as I know, not always the case to that extent. Many delegates and academics, NGO experts know each other on a first name basis, and so I think that that's something that's I think something we need to know, and that's really helpful. So I think important functions are, as we said in the first rounds of comments, to provide context knowledge, to provide background knowledge, to provide just informations on how did we get into this situation, or where does this problem come from, because NGOs, academics are in a much better position than other delegations to explain that, because they don't have like their national baggage, so to say, and can provide more objective information on that. Not that delegates can't provide objective information, it's just in the nature of the functions that it's different. Another, I think, important contribution is facilitate informal meetings, which is difficult at this point, but in general, I think provide spaces, provide platforms for exchange. That's really helpful. And also, I think, to put out ideas that go beyond what's realistic at this point. Of course, it needs to be somehow like imaginable in the BWC context, but just to push delegations a little bit out of what you earlier said, comfort zones, and remind them of what we're actually here to do and what we're actually here to talk about, which is biological disarmament, and maybe not some other smaller side issue that sometimes takes center stage, whereas all this is about biological disarmament. So I think there are many useful, and of course, very practically provide information, write papers like your paper, just explaining how do review conferences work, actually, what is the committee of the whole, and things like that. So there's a whole range of really, really useful activities and things NGOs can do and are doing and have done for the BWC community, I think.
Thank you. And I put the same question to Ambassador Molnar. Zahid, if either of you want to take the floor on this, please.
Yes, thank you. I would only say two things on this. If it was not important what the NGOs say in their papers, and when they have the opportunity to speak at meetings, in that case, NGO participation wouldn't be an issue. But since it is an issue, it shows that it is important what they think and what they say. And in response to the other question, how the ideas of NGOs are picked up and then reflected, definitely because it's state parties who agree on these documents. They don't appear as an idea coming from an NGO. But since NGOs participate not only at the REFCON, but all kinds of meetings, and delegations pay attention to them and listen to them and read what they produce, they think it over, and they build the ideas coming from NGOs into their own position, into their own proposals and working papers. So maybe it's not so visible, but in my view, it has definitely an effect. So that's why I would encourage NGOs to continue working hard on the BWC.
Thank you. And Zahid, please.
I agree. The information coming from NGOs is important. The background, sort of the briefing papers that NGOs, whether it's an academic NGO, whether it's an NGO that looks specifically at BWC issues, these are useful, they're helpful, and they provide and generate ideas. During the meetings itself, the CBW sort of events, the ones that Richard puts forward, I look at those every day. I know members of my delegation do, and most of my colleagues do, and it's very useful. And I thank him for doing that. And I think that's something that all delegates, whether they want to admit it or not, we all take a copy of that when we get into the meeting room and we sort of read it. And some of us, I notice some people, they don't want other people to see that they're reading it, but I know they do. So I think that's very helpful. So there is an important role for that. And for civil society, you have to push governments, because if not, then we work in this vacuum where we think that it is only us and we don't think about other people watching. I think it's a very powerful tool when government representatives see that there are those outside of government, those outside of, meaning, civil society, outside of a government framework, wanting to get something done. Some people might not like it because it's pressure, but I think that is a welcome pressure. I think it's an important pressure because it focuses us to realize that we don't work in a vacuum and that there are sort of bigger issues that we need to look at other than sometimes, what can be sort of really petty politics of it all.
Thank you. I'm conscious of the time. I think there was one question which I haven't touched upon from the list of those submitted, but I think we have got through the rest of them. So my apologies to whoever submitted the last question that we haven't touched upon. But I'm going to suggest that we close the meeting now, unless any of the panelists wish to make any final closing remarks at all, or is there anything you wanted to add? No? No? Okay, in that case, I'd like to conclude by expressing my thanks on behalf of the Institute to all three of you for your contribution. It's been a fascinating discussion. I really am very grateful for you taking the time to join us. Also, thanks to our UNIDIR team here, particularly to Leticia Zarkan, Maria Garzon Macedo, for all the support they've put into producing this event. UNIDIR's BWC-related work is supported by Norway, France, and the Philippines, and we're very grateful for the support, the funding they provide us. Just in terms, and finally, thank you to you, the audience, the participants in this event, for some really useful questions and for coming to join us here. It's very much appreciated. So you are aware you will receive an email from UNIDIR requesting feedback. Alternatively, this can be completed through the window, I think, in the chat, the link in the chat function. That feedback is really helpful for us to be able to work out how to move forward and how to improve our events as we move forward. So please do fill that in. We will continue our work on BWC related issues, and we hope these sorts of events are useful in sustaining discussion around the convention. If people have particular ideas, I'm always happy to talk more about BWC and some things we could potentially do in the future. But for now, though, thank you all for participating, for contributing, and I wish you a good day or good night, depending on where this finds you. So thank you all very much.